Hello, everyone. Okay, the psychology of police investigations. That's what we're going to look at this week. That is chapter 3. Don't forget that on Sunday you do have a quiz due. Good luck, everyone, and I hope you enjoy this class. So what are the learning objectives for this class? We're going to describe the Reid model, of interrogations and outline the 3 potential problems with it. Define the 3 major types of false confessions. Explain why police use criminal profiling and outline potential problems with its uses. Explain what geographical profiling is and how it can be used in police investigations. Let's begin. So let's look at police interrogations. How does that all transpire? So an interrogation is a process of formally and systematically questioning an individual with, of course, the goal and the aim of eliciting useful information relating to the suspected crime. And of course, that is always carried out by a professionally trained law enforcement officer. So let me just give you a wee story about something that happened around us. So I live in Whitby, so this is about 35 miles east of us in Trenton. In 2010, it really changed the landscape for this area. So the commander of the Canadian Forces based in Trenton was stripped of his commands, uniform burned, commissioner of an officer shredded, and his medals destroyed. Yes, he was gone from one of the decorated officers who had flown very important people like the Queen, Prince Philip, the Governor General, the Prime Minister, yes, all over the world, to the subject of the nightly news that repulsed Canadians. We were devastated. Yes, this individual was charged with killing 2 individuals. He asphyxiated both of them, but not before he went into their homes and tried on their lingerie and took pictures of himself. Quite devastating. You will see both videos up online in this weekly module. The confession, which was absolutely brilliantly done by the interviewer, and also I have posted another link because I've given Colonel Russell Williams another diagnosis called paraphilia, a fetish with just any fetish. His happens to be with lingerie. So by day he was a decorated commander, and by night he was a killer. Let's move on. So like I said, I have given Russell Williams an additional diagnosis of paraphilia. The link I have enclosed in this week's module. I've also linked you to the confession. Watch the arrogance of this narcissist in action. The third video that I've posted is an interview with Richard Kuklinski. He's known as the Iceman. He is known to have killed over 100 different individuals. Both of these individuals have been diagnosed with a personality disorder, also known as an antisocial personality disorder. What is the main characteristic of these individuals is they lack empathy or affect. They are quite charming by day. They usually have a home, they could have children, and like I said, they are quite charming. So look at those videos and you will see the difference between how both of these individuals commit the same crime and yet they look different by day. So I shared with you a story about investigations and interrogation with the former Colonel Russell Williams because he had such a high-profile lifestyle. And sometimes when we read in the news and in the media about these heinous crimes or these serial killers, it doesn't resonate with us the same because it's not in our community or even in our country for that matter. However, when it is in your community and it's only a few minutes away from your home, it does really resonate with you, especially when by day this individual had such a high-profiled job dealing with I said, very important people. That was his role. So I'm going to continue with this class, and I want to share a story with you about someone that I knew personally, and the Mr. Big Sting, or the Mr. Big Confession. So this young lady's name is Beverly Smith, and she lived in Raglan, not very far from here. It was a cold winter day when she put her baby. She had a 10-month-old little girl, and she put her to bed, and it was snowing and blowing and cold outside when she must have known whoever knocked on the door because she let them in. There was no force, nothing was broken down, so obviously she went to the door and opened it up. She turned around, and of course, whoever was in the house shot her point blank in the back of the head. So her husband was on the night shift. He worked for GM, and he always called her every night just to check in when he was on break. So of course, she didn't answer. So he called next door, and he said, "Can you go see what's happening with Beverly? She's not picking the phone up." So the neighbor left the house, went next door, and he saw that this woman was laying on the floor in a pool of blood. So they called the police, and of course, her husband, and that's the end of the story. Today, it's still a cold case. So that was 1974. Police first arrested and charged the neighbor, Alan Smith, no association, no relationship whatsoever, with second-degree murder in the case in 2005. The prosecution dropped the case because she said there was no reasonable prospect of a conviction. So later, police decided to set up a Mr. Big sting. So what is that? So some police officers got together and they befriended Alan Smith. They befriended him to a point that there was a really strong relationship between these police officers, unbeknownst to Alan Smith, and Alan Smith. So they hunted and they fished together and they were really bonding. One night, one of the officers confessed that he had actually committed a murder. Therefore, what's Alan Smith do? Alan Smith confesses that he murdered the person next door. So this went on in detail. He professed to committing the murder of Beverly Smith. So the big question is the Mr. Big technique ethical? So this tactic raises issues about the truthfulness of any confession, the use of public resources, and the ethical conduct of the police force. Because of the concerns regarding the potential for coercion, the Mr. Big style investigations has been prohibited in the United States, the United Kingdom, and of course Germany. Is it allowed in Canada? The Mr. Big obtained confessions are now presumably inadmissible. Therefore, this person walked free. So I'm not sure whether he is guilty. However, he did confess. He had details. But again, it was inadmissible in the court of law. So I have posted a video in this week's module. Have a look. And like I said, it's the coldest case in Durham region. So let's look at the REID model, R-E-I-D, the REID model. So over the years, various techniques, of course, have been developed to solve problems with people withholding information and people that are lying about specific information. So one of the most popular techniques that's used in North America is the REID technique. So the REID technique is a 9-step method for investigations. Two of the most important procedures in this REID technique are maximization and minimization, which are used during the 9-step portion of the REID technique, which we'll go over. The investigator wants to use both, like I said, maximization and minimization to investigate, which means they want to exaggerate the strength of the evidence, like I just told you in my personal story, and playing down the crime or making the suspect believe the guy was a bad dude. And that's the minimization technique. So these strategies are used back and forth to get the subject to confess. The technique was named after John E. Reed. Yes, he was a former Chicago police officer. And over the years, they have trained hundreds of thousands of investigators in this particular method, meaning those methods are firmly entrenched within our judicial system, our criminal judicial system. There are 3 steps to this REID interrogation. We will begin with the first, which is our fact analysis. So this is, of course, an in-depth analysis of all the facts and all the evidence and all the facts to determine who should in fact be interviewed. So if there are witnesses, multiple witnesses, if there is a victim, they would be the very first to be interviewed. This is to determine, of course, what happened, all the information they can collect from this victim or victims and witnesses, multiple witnesses, the crime scene, what has been left at the crime scene. If you're not professional, rest assured there are footprints, there are tire tracks, there are hair, there could be possible clothing, all of the effects. So all of this is collected to try to apprehend an offender or offenders. The second stage is referred to as the interrogative interview. So this is where the interview takes place. So once all the information is collected from the witnesses and from the victim, perhaps if there is a victim, and of course the crime scene, this is where it all begins. They've narrowed it down to some suspects. This is always the absolute first contact with the subjects, and it is conducted in a non-accusatory and non-confrontational interview. That is professional, and like I said, it's a non-accusatory interview. Of course, the purpose is to develop an investigative situation so you can obtain information. The interview will always begin with an open-ended sentence, and that invites the subject to be able to just recall what they remember, what they know about the situation. After obtaining this information, they will also be asked specific questions, and those questions could be who, what, where, why, and when, based, of course, on the subject's information that they have revealed themselves. Then comes the behavioral provoking questions. Yes, and this to assess the subject's truthfulness by evaluating the nature of their responses. So again, it's a very interesting psychological technique. Listen to this. A proper conducted behavioral provoking questions can lead to either eliminating the suspicion or not eliminating the suspicion. If the interviewer decides the later category, not eliminated by suspicion, this could result in further questions, different questions, additional targets, investigative resources, and it could continue on thinking that they might have someone of interest. The behavioral provoking questions, this is very interesting as well, which most truthful individuals answer one way, while the deceptive individual often answers in a completely different manner. Let me just give you an example of that. This is an example of a truthful person when they're asking about the punishment. And it doesn't matter whether it's a crime or whether it's somebody at work. It's just a generic question. So what do you think should happen to the person who did whatever this? What do you think should happen to the kind of person that would do something like this, whatever that is? The truthful person will answer like this. Get suspended, get fired, I think they should be prosecuted. The deceptive person would say something along these lines. This is very interesting. Well, that's not up to me. I don't know. That's up to whoever, the boss, the manager, the police officer. Depends on why they did what they did. That's the difference between a truthful person and a deceptive person. And that is just through multiple experiences that they definitely know when somebody, or generally speaking, it's not cause and effect, but they can certainly see through behavior and in words, the truthful person versus a deceptive. So now we reach the final stage. This is the third stage. We call it the final stage, the read 9 steps of interrogation, and we'll go through that step by step in a second. So then once the evidence indicates probable involvement of the subject in committing the act, this would begin the interrogation. Then the interrogation would become appropriate. The foundation of the 9 steps includes obvious empathy, concern, understanding, sound reasoning, logic, all of the above. Under no circumstances during the process is the subject threatened with physical harm, and or are they promised leniency, and or are they told that there would be further punishment if they weren't truthful about their confession. So again, these are all techniques that are pertaining to the Reid model, and like I said, it's used. They've interviewed hundreds and thousands, or trained hundreds of thousands of officers. So this technique, especially in North America, is widely used, and it's very effective. Let's move on, and we will look at the final stage, the 9-step stage of the Reid model in detail. So this is interesting when we are talking about interrogation, and obviously all the pieces of the puzzle are fitting together. So you're this far from having a suspect and getting that suspect off the streets. So we all can be safe from this individual. So you can imagine that there's a little bit of pressure here from the police officer when they have 9 pieces to a 10-piece puzzle. So they're putting a little bit of pressure on there. So I don't know what actually happens behind closed doors, because that's just between the interrogator and the suspect. But do they actually lie about evidence? I would say that they embellish. Lying would be extrapolating something that doesn't even relate to the scenario. But embellish, yes. Do they promise lenient treatment? They don't have the right to say that, and nor do they have the ability to say what a sentence or the outcome would be, because that's based on a jury, a judge, and of course the Crown and the defense. But they could say, if you confess, this might happen. If you do this, this might occur. Your odds are better if you say this and do this than if you say this and do that. Implying threats to loved ones, I doubt that very much. So I will give you a story. This happened a very, very long time ago to my brother's friend, and his name was Red, and he got the nickname because he had very, very, very long, beautiful red hair, like fire red. And he was very eccentric. He was, I think at the time, he was smoking a lot of marijuana. He was a very good drummer. In fact, he prided himself in his talent. He used to take lessons by these world famous drummers, and he was just very good. But he was just different too. I was an introvert, not a person that didn't have much going on in terms of vocabulary. And he lived and rented this old farmhouse on this very dark street, not very far from where I live. And he lived by himself. And one day, a knock come on the door, and it was a police officer. And they asked if he knew his neighbors down the street, and he said he knew of them, but didn't really know them. And apparently, she had been found dead in the culvert, not far from his home. So, of course, that's the beginning of the police investigation. So they go down and up and down the street, and they try to see if there's any association or any relationship, with this individual. So they eventually take him to the police station. So in an observation room, you are basically removed of your senses because it's white. You're not exposed to a drink, and you sit there, and it's warm, and there's no windows, and it's very intimidating. So eventually, he kept saying no, he didn't really know her. He knew of her. He knew she jogged up the street, and they kept on pushing, pushing, pushing. And then the lights went off, and up on the wall come fingerprints, as you can see in my photo. And the fingerprints, the officer said, these fingerprints were found on the body, and they're yours. And he starts to sweat profusely, and now he's trying to convince them. And the more you convince them, the more you think, the more you look like you're lying. It's just an automatic response. So they kept on, and now this is 8 hours later and 10 hours later, and he's having heart palpitations. He's starting to panic. He's sweating a little bit. He is a smoker, and he wants to have a cigarette to reduce some of the stress. He asked for a glass of water, so they eventually go out and they come back in, and they keep getting him to look at those fingerprints, and they keep telling him. Eventually, he was let go, and he went home, frantic. If it wasn't for a neighbor about 2 miles down the road, the mother was washing clothes one day, and she picked up the laundry basket. She thought, geez, these pants feel moist. Like, I wonder why they're wet in this. So when she put them in the laundry basket and turned the water on, red coloring come out, and she started to piece the puzzles together. It was actually her son that had committed the rape and murder. But again, back to an interrogation. I don't know if that would happen today. So this was a very long time ago. Gosh, I was only about 10 or 11 years old. We've told the story numerous times. But it was a very dark, scary time for our friend during this time. So like I said, we are far more educated today. It's not an easy job to have all the pieces of the puzzle. You're just missing one little piece, and you start to put the pressure on the suspect because you're 99% convinced. You just are missing that one final piece of puzzle. So that's where the pressure comes into play. Let's move on. So before I move on to the final stage of the Reid interrogation model in detail, there are some potential problems with the Reid model of interrogation. There is no technique that is 100%. It's like I said, it's used exclusively in North America. Hundreds of thousands of officers have been trained using this model, but there are some issues, and those issues we have to be aware of when this technique is used. So, can an interviewer detect a lie? So remember I talked about not eliminated by suspicion or eliminated by suspicion. Remember I addressed both of those points. Well, this could This could be problematic because there could be biases here that may result when an interrogator believes, perhaps incorrectly, that a suspect is guilty. So again, we have to be very vigilant of these issues. Here's another issue. Is a coercive or suggestive nature of certain interrogation practices and possibility of these practices which result in various types of confession. So that brings me to the question, and I'm asked all the time, why would an individual confess to something they did not do? Well, I told you about my friend, or my brother's friend. It was horrific. The anxiety-provoking situation, and over a long period of time. No escape whatsoever. And your chair doesn't move in an interrogation room. The interviewer's chair does, but yours doesn't. So you're staying there. You're isolated to that spot. So some individuals confess because they just want the interrogation to stop. Police interrogations can last hours and hours. Remember, you're in that room and they're trying to rid you of your senses. The only way you know life is through your 5 senses. And now you're sitting in that room and you're just feeling stifled. Oftentimes, the stress and the lack of rest and manipulative interrogation techniques can get the better of an individual, even if they are innocent. They just want to get out and their mind is racing. So they think, if I just confess and then I can get out, then I can get a lawyer and then I can tell somebody else that I didn't do it. That's how they start to think. They just want it to stop. And they will do anything they can to get this to happen, including confessing to something they didn't do. They want to avoid harsher sentences in many cases. Police may tell a suspect, like I already talked about, that the evidence is so strong that they're going to be convicted no matter what. But if they provide a confession, their sentence will be less lenient. So they're using all these psychological techniques. And the longer the individual is in this room, being housed with no window, virtually no air, a light hanging over the table, can't move your chair, yeah, they're starting to panic a little bit. And here's one of those stories. I can bring up many, but this one is very near and dear to me. This is called the Dixmuir 5. These individuals settled by the judge $40 million altogether. They were accused of rape and murder of a 14-year-old girl jogger that was running in Central Park. They collectively, all 5 of them, were behind bars for 95 years. Their names are Hardin, Barr, Taylor, Veal, and Sharp. They were convicted on their false confession, panicking, stress. They were American black males. Thinking, oh my gosh, what is going on here? Just panic alone. The conviction occurred even though the DNA testing of the Illinois Police Crime Laboratory had exclusively excluded all 5 based on semen from the victim. So they were exonerated in 2011. The semen found on the girl was sent to a new lab. So the case was opened up, and the source identified Willie Randall, who was out on parole after serving 20 years. So from sitting in our living room and we go, well, they must be guilty because they confessed. No, not necessarily. The stress, the anxiety of being in that room and bombarded. And then when one interrogator leaves the room, another interrogator comes in and they're regenerated and they start with the questionings as well. It's trying to break the individual down for confession. So let's continue on. I just want to touch on a couple of more issues with interrogation and the Reid model. Studies have found that neutral observers that are watching an interrogator where the interrogator believes that the individual or the suspect is guilty, they apply more coercive interrogation techniques. And that's just from a neutral group of individuals that are observing the interaction. Interrogators with guilty expectations have found to use higher frequency of techniques. Interrogators with guilty expectations judge the suspect to be guilty. So that's problematic. When you're going into a situation, you must remain neutral, because if you don't, you're going to see what you expect to see. That's that self-fulfilling prophecy. So a good interrogator must always go in neutral and collect the facts. Interrogators indicated that they exert more pressure on a suspect if they think they're guilty. And this is also some research that is very interesting too. And again, research is always ongoing because we've learned from the past, and as we move forward, what didn't work, we try to change it and alter that. So research has revealed that confronting a suspect with false evidence is quite common in the United States, and it happens in about approximately 30% of custodial interviews. This strategy is allowed in the United States, illegal, however, in several Western European countries. So again, we're getting better with what didn't work and what's acceptable. Okay, so let's go over each step of the READ technique model. So let's begin with the first point. So it's called direct positive communication, which involves directly confronting the suspect with a statement that it is known that he or she has committed the crime. Often, the police lie and describe non-existent evidence that points to the suspect as the offender, repeatedly stating confidence in their guilt. This involves the investigator to present facts of the case, whether they are real or not, wanting to raise the suspect's stress level. Number 2, the second point. We call it theme development. It's also known as the non-accusatory interview. This is a step in which the police present a hypothesis about the reason for which the suspect committed the crime in the first place. This theme minimizes the moral implications of the alleged offense, or allows a suspect to save face by having a morally acceptable excuse for committing the crime. And this is some techniques that an officer would say or use. The officer may say, I understand why you acted in the way that you did. This guy is known to us. This guy is bad news. He had it coming to him. Really good psychological technique. The third strategy. The officer refuses any statement of denial. So every time the accused or the suspect says anything about him not being involved, immediately the officer stops any statement of that. And again, the officer or investigator continues to state that he is guilty, that he is a suspect, that he is the suspect that committed the crime. The fourth point, overcoming objections. So the officer does not accept a suspect's excuse or explanation, as well as always letting the suspect know, and they should be very aware that they are being investigated using all the psychological techniques that he can pull out of his hat. He keeps repeating that. The fifth point, procurement and retention of the suspect's attention. This is very important. The interrogator reduces the physical and psychological space between the two. Remember, the suspect is always in a stationary chair. He or she isn't moving. The investigator, however, is on a rolly chair. So the second that this individual or this suspect appears to be kind of fading out and daydreaming and looking around, he can wheel himself or his chair into the space of the suspect to gain his attention back again. So again, this prevents the suspect from emotionally withdrawing or turning out from the remainder of the interrogation, because that's not what you want. Let's look at the sixth point. So handling the suspect's passive mood. Again, this is a continuation of the fifth step. You always want to get in the space and get in the mindset of the suspect. So whatever you have to do on it, that means rolling over and getting in his space or getting in his space. That's exactly what you do. Number 7, presenting an alternative question technique. This is a really interesting strategy. For example, this takes place when the interrogator gives 2 possible alternatives for why the crime was committed. Both alternatives are still incriminating, but one is presented as a face-saving, more acceptable. It's a more morally blameless than the other. And here's a couple of examples. The officer may say, like I repeated before, the guy was dirty. I know what he did to your family. I know his history. Or he can say, you killed that guy in cold blood murder. So again, 2 different strategies. You're getting, you're trying to get it, a confession, and you've got 2 polarized statements. So you're hoping that the suspect bites onto one of them. Hopefully the first one, because the second one is very confrontational. It maximizes the strategy or the technique. Number 8, suspects admits to crime, having the suspect relate, and you get them to orally relate the details of the offense. This involves a one-on-one. That means that the interrogator and the suspect is in the room all by themselves, and it is for this purpose of getting the suspect to give a detailed account of the crime and what actually happened, and to establish their legal guilt. Number 9, oral confession, one-on-one with the interrogation, and you want to convert that oral confession into the written. So they are all of the strategies involved in the READ technique model of interrogation. So we're continuing on about techniques in the READ technique model. So in addition to gathering evidence, non-accusatory stage and accusatory stage, the interrogation techniques can also be broken down into maximization and minimization. They are both interrogation techniques that can be used during an investigative interview. For example, the maximization is an interrogation technique that seeks to establish the seriousness of the offense and intimidate the suspect. The interrogator uses a variety of manipulated steps, like continuing to accuse the suspect, confronting the suspect with incriminating facts, or portraying the offense as an extremely morally reprehensible act of crime. So again, the goal of the maximization techniques is to increase the pressure on the suspect to elicit more information or to force them to confess. Minimization, on the other hand, is to decrease the perceived severity of the crime from the suspect, giving the suspect moral excuses. So they're trying to work on the moral compass of the suspect, portraying the criminal behavior as normal or suggest the suspect's behavior has a morally acceptable reason for doing so, or say that others or the victim are also responsible for the offense. It wasn't just the person that did the offense. There are other people involved that put pressure on the suspect. Okay, moving on. Now, the procedural safeguards are in fact in place to protect the individual during that transition to the interrogation phase of the Reid model. So yes, they're not put in there and they're not held down by sticks and ropes and chains. There are issues and things that are in place. There's safeguards to prevent the suspect from saying something that could be used against them in court. So models such as the individual's Miranda rights in Canada. So in Canada, the rights of a suspect are included, yes, in our Charter of Rights, which we looked at last week, and freedoms. That includes the right to silence and legal counsel. So if you've ever seen any CIA on television, you will have heard the officer use this over and over and over again. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, you will be provided for you. One will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me? So invoking your Miranda rights, if the individual indicates at any time, in any manner, prior to or during the questioning, that he or she wishes to remain silent, the interrogation must cease immediately. If the individual states that he or she wants an attorney, the interrogation must cease until an attorney is present. At that time, the individual must have the opportunity to confer with their attorney and to have him or her present during any questions or subsequent questions moving forward. So in both Canada and the United States, it is only when the suspect knows and voluntarily waives these rights that their statements can be used as evidence in court against them. So there are safeguards in place for the suspect. Moving on, and we're still looking at interrogation. So let's look at interrogation practices and the court. So this is very interesting, this confession between Brown versus Mississippi. So who in fact makes the decisions to admit confession evidence in court? Well, the trial judge does. The trial judge must know that the confession that was made was voluntarily and whether the defendant was competent at the time when they provided the confession. So let's look at the case Brown versus Mississippi. So we have a planter that was murdered in Mississippi in 1934. 3 black tenant farmers were arrested and they were charged with first-degree murder. This is what happened during the trial. The only evidence was the defendant's confession to the police officer. They confessed only after they were brutally beaten by the officers. They were stripped of their clothes, they were laid over chairs and beaten until they confessed. One defendant claimed that he was strung up by his neck from a tree in addition to being beaten. The unanimous decision was the defendant's confession that was extracted by police violence could not be entered as evidence and it violated the due process clause. Yeah. Between 1936 and 1966, the use of torture to extract confessions declined greatly a major accomplishment by the American courts and criminal justice reformers. Had their evidence not been allowed in court, these men would have been sentenced to death. Pretty powerful. We've come a long way in our judicial system, thank God. So again, you just heard that evidence of being coerced into a confession wasn't allowed in court. But do you think parts of the Reid model technique of confession are in fact forms of coercion, especially the accusatory stage of the Reid model? Food for thought, something to think about as we're moving forward. So practices in court, just like I said, the trial judge plays an important role in admitting confessions in court. Yes, the judge must determine, in fact, if the confession was voluntarily given and whether the individual was competent. Today, if confessions are overtly coercive, if physical force is used in any way, if the alleged perpetrator has been deprived of sleep, of isolation, refused water when they've asked, well, it's problematic. This cannot occur. So let's look at the next case. Okay, well, let's look at a court case then. So one of the most important court cases to deal with questionable confessions is the Supreme case of R versus Okal in 2000. So Okal voluntarily confessed to 7 counts of arson in Nova Scotia between 1994 and 1995. That confession comes after questionable techniques were used to extrapolate Okal's confession. These included exaggerating the infallibility of the polygraph exam, implying psychiatric help would be provided if in fact Okal confessed, and that Okal's girlfriend at the time would be spared an in-depth investigation if he confessed. So the trial judge deemed the confession admissible. He said it was voluntary, and of course Okal was charged with arson. The Court of Appeal deemed the confession as evidence inadmissible and entered an acquittal. And then that went to the next level, which was the Supreme Court of Canada. So an appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, a ruling was handed down stating that Okal's confession was properly admitted by the first trial judge, and therefore his conviction should stand despite the interrogation techniques used to extrapolate the confession. In this decision from the Supreme Court of Canada, they also, in addition to saying that this confession was voluntary, they also laid out a 4-point framework for, in fact, determining whether a confession should be deemed voluntary. So here they are. The court must consider whether the police made any threats or promises to the accused, number 1. Number 2, the court must look at inhumane abuse. Number 3, the court must look to ensure that the person was in fact mentally capable of making the confession at the time that they were interrogated. So are they of sane mind? And the final one, the court must consider the amount of police trickery in the interrogation process. So as a result, this case has widespread implications for interrogation practices and subsequent prosecutions. And remember, we are growing, we are changing, we are more educated, we understand techniques, we understand psychology, we're implementing, we're not having to force or use force, because there was a time when force was used. Let's continue on. So just like there isn't one great assessment tool, there are other alternatives to interrogation techniques or interrogation models. So because of the potential problem that can result from using these coercive interrogation techniques, police agencies in several countries have introduced and changed their procedures. For example, in England and Wales, they have attempted to reduce oppressive interrogation practices. So therefore, they have implemented the model PEACE, P-E-A-C-E. So PEACE is based on an interview method known as the conversation management, which encourages information gathering more than it does securing a confession. So I would say that they use more of a minimization technique rather than the maximization technique, that coercive, all of these threat techniques. This is more of a minimization technique. Let's look at the acronyms. So PEACE is the acronym for Planning and Preparation, Engage and Explain, Account, Closure, and Evaluation. Let's begin with P for planning. So the interrogator gathers all the information about the case, the suspect, and any evidence before the interrogation even begins. E is for engage and explain. So a rapport is established at this point with the suspect, and the interrogator explains the purpose of the interview and encourages cooperation. A is for account. To encourage a working dialogue, the interrogator will use open-ended questions, and this encourages the suspect to provide an account of the events. C is for closure. So the interrogator wraps up the interview, summarizing the main points established and discussed between the two. And of course, E at the end is for evaluation. So the evidence and the suspect's statements are evaluated to determine what are the next steps. Where do we go from here in our investigation? So it is noted that it is a call for Canadian researchers to replace their current interrogation methods and to introduce the peace model in their interrogation. So it's very interesting because one analysis has shown that approximately 50% of all suspects confessed to crime before and after the peace model was introduced. So again, there is lots of positive affirmation between using the read tactic and using the peace model tactic. So I'm just going to reiterate one more time about this peace method model of interrogation. It encourages more of this dialogue, creating this, establishing a rapport between the interviewer and the suspect. And again, it's a non-intimidating environment. So like I say, it uses more of a minimization technique than a maximization technique. And like I said, it was developed in Britain in response to the realization that these psychological coercive techniques often lead to false confessions, which is hard to believe, which we're going to look at in a minute. So in 2015, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police adopted this new standard influenced by the peace model. So we are at the end of the first part of chapter 3. There are 3 smaller lessons to this chapter. So click on to part 2 and then of course to part 3. Don't forget to look at any videos that are located in this module, which would be week 3. So good luck with everyone, and I'll see you in part 2. Have a good one. So I finished the first part of this chapter by talking about the peace model was more advantageous for not getting false confessions. So it's like people actually confess when they didn't do it. Well, that's what this section is going to look at. Let's have a look. So I'm going to tell you about a story that I know that I've seen this individual many, many times speak at conferences and tell his side of the story. But imagine doing time behind bars for 20, 25 years when you didn't do the crime. You weren't even near the crime scene, and yet the jury has convicted you of first-degree murder. It's beyond comprehensible to me. So problems with confessions, the fact that a confession evidence does not mean that the confession is actually true, number one. One approach to establishing false confessions would be to examine those wrongfully convicted, which I'm going to tell you about in a second. In 25% of cases where prisoners have been exonerated through DNA, contained a false confession. So they do happen, and I'm telling you, when you are deprived of your senses, which is what we know our life through our five senses, they can break us down pretty darn easy. So I'll tell you about a story, and his name is David Milgaard. He was 16 at the time when he took a road trip to Regina. He left Regina with a friend heading to Vancouver to pick another friend up along the way. They arrived at another friend's house the next day. That friend rented the basement apartment of this apartment building. Although no one knew at the time, this man by the name of Larry Fisher was actually a serial rapist who had just assaulted and murdered Gail Miller, a nurse walking home that night from work. That is the murder that David Milgaard was convicted of. So police investigated 160 possible suspects with no leads. After the men had returned home from the road trip, the other friend, Albert, called the police to report that his friend David Milgaard was acting very weird the day of the murder. He claimed he could also see blood on David's clothes. So over weeks, there were many interviews with David. One of the other men said that David had confessed to him of killing the young nurse. He was arrested, therefore, and he was charged with rape and murder of Gail Miller, that nurse. 23 years in prison, and with the help of his mother, they never wavered one day. She finally got him out. She was tenacious. She fought the system every day of her life. Kudos to her. He still did 23 years. She launched her own investigation, taking David's story to the media, and that was one way of exposing and trying to get to the root of who actually did this. Meanwhile, this culprit, Larry Fisher, like I said, the real culprit, was released from jail for raping women. By this time, police knew, in fact, Fisher was actually the man responsible here. So, in 1988, David appealed to the Minister of Justice for a review of his conviction, but the minister dismissed the application. However, the minister did ask the Supreme Court of Canada to provide an option about what should happen next in David's case. So, in 1992, this must be so painful for David and his family, but in 1992, the court concluded that David's conviction should be squashed and a new trial ordered. After 25 years in prison, David was finally a free man. So my question to you is, he was awarded $10 million for his wrongful conviction. Do you think $10 million is enough for 23 years behind bars for something you did not do? I am surprised he did not go crazy out of his mind. I mean, it's one thing to go to jail knowing that you did it. It's another thing going to jail and being punished for 23 years for something you did not do. So I've seen David, I've seen him speak at many conferences, and 23 years definitely had a toll on his life. There's no doubt about it. Let's continue. So we already talked about why somebody would confess when they didn't do the crime in the last lesson, but let's continue on here. One of the most, like I said, the most common questions asked about innocent cases is, why would anyone confess to a crime they did not commit? We already talked about that. We're going to continue on here because here's another very interesting case. The fact is that false confessions are one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions. Research studies have actually pinpointed the reasons why false confessions happen and what reforms are needed moving forward. Now, we already talked about it, but I'm going to go over them slightly again. So misclassification errors occur when the officer decides that an innocent person is actually guilty. That's that biases we were talking about last time. Coercion errors occur when they are subjected to psychological coercive factors, such as they're put in that observation room, so they're feeling stressed, they're feeling fatigue, these lengthy questionings, different investigators walking in with new energized energy to continue on, mental and physical abuse, or not abuse, but fatigue abuse. Contamination error occurs after admitting guilt. The police help create a narrative of the crime that includes facts that an innocent person would not know. So in 1989, a female jogger, we're back at Central Park again, was found brutally attacked and raped in Central Park. The crime caused an uproar in New York City, and the police were under extreme pressure. That's another thing. It's one thing to have a crime, especially something like this. It's another thing that the society or the community or the town or the city puts on the police, because now they feel fear of being able to leave their house or walk around. They don't feel safe. So they're putting pressure on the police to apprehend someone and have someone responsible so they can feel safe again in their community. So again, the police are under pressure to find these people responsible. So 5 black youth, Kevin Richardson, Santana, Corey Wise, aged 14 to 16, were seen in the park that night. And they were, of course, were arrested for the crime and therefore interrogated. Under intense police questioning, 4 of the boys admitted to roles in the crime and they implemented the others. But the youths also gave conflicting accounts of the crime, and none of the DNA evidence matched any of them. All of them later said they were coerced into giving false statements. All 5 youths were exonerated when a serial rapist confessed to the crime and the DNA tied him to the crime scene. Oh gosh, let's move on. So those wrongly convicted are examined to determine if a false confession was to blame for the wrongful conviction. So again, this isn't a perfect science. This is a good science, and for the most part, our judicial system does work, but it has flaws in it. There is no doubt about it. It has flaws. When you're a part of the flaw, it's really problematic. One study examined 241 cases where prisoners were in fact exonerated through DNA testing, indicated that 24.48% of these cases contained false confessions as a contributing cause of the wrongful conviction. For those of you who do not know Barry Charles Sheck, he pioneered, thank God, DNA evidence. So it's because of Barry that cases have gone back and people have been exonerated due to DNA evidence. So thank God we have that science behind us now. Okay, continuing on, let's look at retractable confessions. Okay, what's that? So a retractable confession generally refers to the statement made by the defendant in a criminal case, admitting guilt, but then later withdrawing or recanting that. So we can go back to the Central Park jogger case, in which all of the boys retracted their confessions immediately upon arrest and said that they had confessed because they were scared, they were young, and had expected to be allowed to go home if they confessed. Yeah. You know, again, they were scared, and who knows what happened in the interrogation room, but that's why they confessed. They thought, if I confess, I'll be able to get out of here, and then I'll be able to think, or go to my parents, or go for help, or something. So in order to have a confession that is allowed by the trial judge, for a confession to be allowed in court, it must be, like I said, voluntarily and without coercion, and it can't be under pressure. The person cannot say, it doesn't even have to be physical now. It could simply be you're scared, you're petrified, you're in this room, you're all by yourself, you don't have the language, the skills, the knowledge to be able to reach out. All of those apply to whether your confession was voluntary and whether the person was competent as well. Inconsistencies. A defendant might retract a confession if they later claim it was false. For sure. Again, we can go back to the Central Park jogger. They were petrified. Evidence and witnesses. The court may examine various forms of evidence as well, including the circumstances of the initial confession. Let me see how that went down. Impact of the case. A retractable confession can have a significant impact on the prosecution's case. So it does happen. So a disputed confession would be a confession that is later disputed at trial, and that's exactly what these 5 young men did. Is they disputed their confession. They were terrified, and for whatever reason, I know it's virtually impossible for you and I to ever fathom thinking that an individual would sit there in a police interrogation room and confess to something that we did not do. So it's very hard to understand that. But that's what these boys did. It was a disputed confession, and regarding this jogger in Central Park. What's very interesting, if you look to the right of the screen, that is Mateus Reyes, and he is the individual that actually raped and killed that jogger. Had a horrific life. He started to have these outbursts of anger, which led to attacking women, which led to raping them and then killing them. So he has a whole host. But when he was asked why he eventually confessed, he simply said because he thought it was the right thing to do. Let's move on. Oh, I could read these all day. This can consume my entire life. Famous case of voluntary false confession. It's so hard for me to get my head wrapped around stuff like this. 1932, kidnapping and the murder of the Lindeberg baby. 200 people falsely confessed. What? That's crazy. For notoriety? I don't know, 2 years later, of course, somebody was arrested. But as a result, the Lindeberg kidnapping case led the United States Congress to pass the Federal Kidnapping Act, also known as the Lindeberg Law. The act made kidnapping a federal offense and allowed federal jurisdiction investigators the authority to pursue kidnappers right across state jurisdiction. So the circumstances surrounding the trial in which a German immigrant carpenter by the name of Bruno Hauptmann was convicted of murder, and it still leaves many wondering if in fact justice was really carried out. Inspiring conspiracy theories for sure that have haunted this case since the absolute beginning. So in 1932, the baby was stolen from a crib in the second floor of the bedroom with both Lindberghs and several staff members elsewhere. They were in the house, but they were elsewhere in the house. A random note, a broken ladder propped it against the outside wall, and other clues were discovered over the next few weeks, not to mention the numerous letters and tips that poured in. 10 weeks after the kidnapping, the baby was actually found, with no suspect, no leads, and the case went cold. 2 years later, out comes a random bill. It surfaced, leading investigators to indict, in fact, the carpenter Bruno Hauptmann, a German immigrant, and he was charged on extortion and murder in the first degree. Hauptmann pleaded guilty. He pleaded not guilty. He was found guilty, however, in the first degree, and he was sentenced to death by execution. So it's still, did they get the right person? And imagine 200 people falsely confessing. That's fascinating to me. That's up there with why would so many women in particularly write these serial killers in jail? And it's on a daily basis, and they're inspired by them, and they give them hope, and it becomes a real codependency relationship. But this 200 people false confession is up there with that. Let's move on. So while we are on the same point about notoriety and about these 200 false confessions, oh, it's so hard to get your head around, but we have to talk. We must address Mark Chapman. He's the individual that killed John Lennon, the famous Beatle, in New York City. And the ironic thing about Mark Chapman is in the morning when Lennon and his wife Yoko were leaving the apartment, their high-rise condo, Mark Chapman was actually in the foyer, and he stopped John Lennon and asked for his autograph. And John willingly signed a piece of paper and gave it over to Mark Chapman. They left, and when they returned, Mark Chapman was outside of the condo again. He took his revolver out, and of course he killed John Lennon, and it was fatal. But the interesting aspect about that is he was asked why he killed John Lennon, and he was motivated by fame, he said. And I quote, "I wasn't going to be a nobody." So when we're looking at notoriety and why people do what they do, there's a really great example. And last time, remember, I was telling you about women that send letters, love letters to these serial killers or killers that have done heinous crimes. We call it hybritsophilia, and it's a paraphilia and disorder involving sexual interests and attractions to those that commit crimes, and many times it's heinous crimes. So again, we got to look at all of these variables, you know, people that have all of these disorders, and it's interesting to investigate and of course to research. Let's move on. So continuing on, we're going to look at a case of child abuse. 2000, a father was accused of aggravated assault on his little wee son. In the written statement, the judge said the confession was written to escape an oppressive atmosphere of the interrogation. The accused pled guilty to causing bodily harm. He was charged with the crime. The little gaffer was 3 months old. They also took x-rays to find there was a broken rib, and the testimony suggested that the broken rib was caused by the baby being shaken. The interrogators used the Reid technique, for example. One of the minimization statements would have been, no doubt it probably was an accident on your part. I don't believe it was intentional at all. The judge stated the case of a classical slavish adherence to a technique that can produce a coercive, compliant, false confession. An apology even from the accused who had denied 35 times that he did not do, and he did not do this. He did nothing wrong. He was caring for his child. As a result of these findings, the confession evidence was deemed inadmissible. The father was interrogated by 3 senior detectives for a total of 7.5 hours using the Reid technique of interviewing and interrogation. The Alberta Provincial Court was very critical of the police's interrogation technique and ruled these statements by the accused were not voluntary at all. An alleged confession in the form of an apology was ambiguous and was extracted by threats such as your children will be taken away from you and they'll be raised by foster parents, and implied promises like you'll get a less charge, you'll be able to reunite with your family, or they're going to take a polygraph test too. We're going to put them through the ringer. These 3 different interrogations were all oppressive. The confession was written to escape the oppressive atmosphere of this horrific interrogation, and as a result of these findings, the confession evidence was deemed inadmissible. So we're continuing on. Here's another really bizarre confession. It's called a coerced, internalized false confession. And that's a result from suggestive interrogation techniques whereby the confessor actually comes to actually believe that they committed the crime. Although these situations are very rare, they do happen. So here's the story on Billy Wayne Cope. So the husband woke up to find that his daughter Amanda had been raped and murdered while he was sleeping. His wife did not hear the crime taking place because of the whirling of the fans and the noises in the area. After more than 600 denials from Billy himself saying he did not commit the crime, in addition to multi-polygraph tests, the police finally managed to extort 4 confessions from him. They used leading questions, feeding him ideas on how he might have committed the crime. They reenacted the crime for him. In each of these 4 confessions, in detail, he continually changed each one of them. The police even forced his wife to wire up and interrogate her while giving Billy no notice or alerting his legal counsel, which we already know is a violation of his constitutional rights, right, because of the Miranda rights. They also threatened her that if she didn't do the interrogation, she would not get her children back that were already now put in a foster care. However, the police refused to drop the charges on Billy because Billy had already confessed. They, in fact, proceeded to charge him for the crime. So a month later, the DNA results came back, and yes, indeed, it was not Billy's DNA that was on Amanda, but it was that of James Sanders, who was known to habitually break into homes and sexually assault his victims. Billy later on lost the custody and the parental rights of his 2 remaining children. They even refused to see him and visit him, as the prosecution had decided to show the kids videos of his